Hello, everyone, and welcome back down here to the Gamer's Den with me, your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire. And I promise at some point I will get back to doing more work on D20 Modern, fixing it, adding in things, and making little tweaks and adjustments here and there. I'm kind of having to restrain myself from writing too much and just kind of trying to condense things down a little bit to where I can present different factions both with a useful level of detail, but also in a timely fashion, so I'm not making hour long, 3 hour long videos. But that'll come down the line, and hopefully soon, some kind of a PDF or just text file format that you can copy or download freely and make use of without having to go through that long list of slides there. That's a little bit unwieldy, especially at this point. Useful for maybe making up individual videos, but not so much for going through if you're trying to use these and incorporate them in running your own games of D20 Modern. But today, since I've been talking about politics a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about history and culture and also time. Now, how am I looping all three of these things together? Well, it has to do with how the different species in most fantasy games tend to interact. And specifically, I'm taking a look at humans, dwarves, and elves, because they all approach these three things very differently. Now, take a human concept of history. I mean, just take a look at our own. We have so many different holidays and events and festivals and celebrations all peppered throughout the year. Now, culture to culture, it's different. Uh, Germany, Japan, with the different religious and cultural events, they can have so many different festivals. I mean, you take a look at, the Shinto religion in Japan, and also you still have a little bit of Buddhism and Christianity, and then just their own specific endemic national holidays and uh, just their own little cultural events that come up. Not just the religious cultural stuff, but just like general Japanese culture. They have so many different events that are celebrated throughout the year. In Germany, so many different holidays and events and festivals that go up throughout the year. Just so many events where these communities come together and celebrate with one another. Not only are these cultural social gatherings, but a lot of these are also tied to different historical events as well. I mean, take Christmas as an example, or Thanksgiving. These are based off of, well, of historical events. However accurately they may be depicted, it can be argued about to no end, but we're not going to worry about that so much here. We're just looking at just how that fits within games and portraying cultures and how different species or races, whatever you want to slice that up as, how they portray them and approach these things. So for humans, we have a lot of festivals and holidays for different events. Lunar holidays, religious holidays, cultural events, different things that crop up over time, and it's a lot of it's tied to celebrating and remembering our own history. Some of that history is mythological in its origins, some of it is actual historical events. But think about the fact that we have, what, 80 years, 100 years fantasy games, especially if you're leaning more into the medieval aspect, you might be looking more around the 60-ish range. These events are tied to remembering that history because we have such a limited time span. This is a way of passing things on to the next generation and the generation after, going on and on and on. Especially if you're in a setting or time period where accurate record keeping can be kind of spotty. Um, the number of people that understand how to read and write and how to properly document and catalog history, that can be hit or miss, and how reliable all of that is. And not only that, but just, well, one good dragon attack and poof, there goes the library, there go all the records. Now it's just word of mouth, oral tradition, and these different festivals, these different celebratory events. So all of these things kind of come together and kind of start making the histories, at least in human culture, for these kinds of settings a little unreliable. Informative, still helpful, and can give you an idea of why they're celebrating, but they can be some maybe more or less accurate than others. And that's because of our limited lifespan. Now, think about dwarves. Think about elves. Dwarves, what do they top out at? 5 or 6 centuries, give or take. If we go with the 60 years as the our average human lifespan for a medieval fantasy setting, 6 centuries is 10 lifetimes, 10 generations, roughly, give or take. That dwarf may well remember the specific event that a festival is tied to. An elf, certainly. I mean, elves top out around what, 900 to 1100 years, and that's assuming you're not playing a game or setting where it's possible for elves to essentially be immortal unless some kind of physical trauma happens to them, whether through accidents, disease, or violence. Getting stabbed through the heart tends to be pretty lethal for elves still, just like humans. But elves may well also probably remember either through direct witnessing or remember hearing about specific events. And given the length of lifetimes that both of these races live, the idea that they pick up and retain and are able to pass on the ability to read and write is not all that far fetched. I mean, that also kind of should explain why they are also slower to reproduce, because they have more time for all of that. Also, they reach reproductive maturity at a much slower rate, but that's a whole nother ball game right there. Uh, the idea being that an elf might look at human culture and just see, month after month, here's a festival, here's a holiday, they're celebrating this now. Holy crap, these people spend a lot of their time partying. And they may also look at some of these events, hear the story, and go, yeah, that's not right. I was there for that. I remember your great 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 grandfather. He was a massive douche. And thus, the elf pisses off the human community, which also might kind of explain the old trope of elves being kind of standoffish, know it all dicks. That's, it might just be because the elf is like, yeah, I know exactly who you're talking about. I know what happened. He was a jerk. I'm glad he died, and I don't know why you people are celebrating him. But nobody wants to hear about how uh, their great 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 ancestor was looting, rioting, raping, murdering asshat of a person. They want to remember what a heroic, bold figure he was, because those are the stories that they grew up with and that have kind of shaped their culture. It's one thing for one person's history or concept to be wrong, but to kind of tear everything down, this whole myth that a culture might be built around, attacking the framework, a cultural framework for their society, that creates a lot of hostility pretty damn fast. But on the flip side of that coin, these different races, because of their different abilities in record keeping, time, and memory, and thus, the impact on all of their cultures, these other races, if they know anything about these events, they can help lend more knowledge to all of that too, especially if, it's good or reassuring information. It's like, uh, oh yeah, Saint Sebastian, I I remember him. I adventured with him. Great guy. Really actually more honorable than you're really letting on here. He did some incredible things. I thought I was a good fighter. He might have just been a human, but oh my goodness, he had an ability of a dwarf with a few centuries of fighting experience. that person knew how to work a spear. And oh goodness, I remember one time he skewered 5 goblins all at once. 5? The story says 3. No, 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 no. It was 5, and it was incredible. You might have things like that happen where it's just like, that's really damn cool. And that can, help tie different groups together in that fashion. But I think you get the idea that I'm belaboring at this point. The idea is that these races, because of their different lifespans, that will affect their culture. That will affect how they interact with one another because humans don't live as long, and thus we have a cultural memory more than we do a personal one because the culture and the history outlives us. For dwarves, that history is massively important as well, but most of them will remember it. Remember it longer and keep the stories a bit more accurate because they were alive for it. There were witnesses for it, and more of the witnesses are alive for it, so they can kind of correct for one another's gaps in information. Whereas, within the 60-year span, you may end up with only one human who remembers what happened 40 years ago because everybody else is dead, and they may not remember everything correctly or may not have been able to bear witness to everything that happened in a specific event. So they just kind of come up with their best educated guess from what they know had happened. But as they tell and retell that story, and they tell their kids, and that those kids tell the grandkids, and then the great grandkids, and on, those retellings can either become embellished, somebody forgets a piece, or unconsciously somebody ends up filling in a little bit of detail that really wasn't there in the original retelling, but it just keeps moving forward. Whereas, like I said, with dwarves, or even, again with elves, if one dwarf misremembers, there might be 2 or 3 others that just slap them on the back of the head and go, "That's not what happened, ass for brains. This is what happened. I was there for this part. You weren't there for that part. I was over here and I got this view there of this rogue slipping in behind the shadows behind the lich, and he decapitated him with a nice solid sneak attack to the back of the neck with that holy dagger." Or, whatever story may have been. Uh, Anyways, like I said, you get the idea. I could belabor this point for a while, but they're going to they're going to have fundamentally different cultures and different histories just because of the fact that they have different scales of time that they're working with. And also think about what that does for their cultural advancement and adaptability. Uh, Humans, because we can change so much just between generations, I mean, take a look at our current real world history, how quickly things can change within a generation or two, especially in the information age that we live in right now. Things can change and develop so rapidly. But that imagine if we lived, 200 years, how much more slowly things might change. I mean, the US is not even 300 years old yet. I mean, imagine if Thomas Jefferson had been alive for 200 years. On the one hand, when he was alive, he's a radical, dynamic force of change within the US government. And he is also considered a raving lunatic by several people. But he was also, and I'm getting into a certain amount of current politics here, and just please bear with me. He was also kind of crazy racist. He owned slaves. He really, really hated the Native American tribes. I mean, Trail of Tears and everything. That's pretty goddamn brutal and awful. And imagine if he lived for 200 years. I mean, granted, his presidency would have been limited, but if he probably would have stayed within politics and would have been a major voice and in a position of power for a long time. Imagine how much longer all of that gets prolonged. Now, if we all had that average of 200 years, that might not seem like much, but just imagine if other people lived that could only be around for, 60, 70 years. How much more slowly things would progress in their minds looking at these, uh, you know, multi century living beings that ruled, controlled, and dominated everything. How much more awful those conditions would be because they are prolonged, because the leadership's lives, or the dominant species lives, went on so much longer. Think about how slowly things would change then, and that's going to get to be more of a progressively increasing thing the longer lived each species is. So dwarves living 600 years, that would make their culture incredibly slow to change, on top of the fact that, at least typically within like the base core books for a lot of different games, dwarves are already slow to trust and change to begin with. They don't like a lot of outside ideas, and new ideas are carefully scrutinized for centuries in a lot of cases. Like, Warhammer Fantasy, for example. The Engineers Guild, even if a new invention is incredibly useful, if the dwarf engineer who developed it deploys it too quick, they'll be kicked out of the Engineers Guild and maybe brought back a century or two later after the device has already proved itself admirably in whatever field it was developed for. So things progress very slowly for dwarves. Imagine how much more difficult it is for things to progress for creatures that live 1,000 years, 2,000, 3,000. How much harder it is for their culture to change because, well, this is how it's always been done. This is how it's been done in my lifetime. I don't see a reason for it to change. I've been here 800 years. This has worked for this long. Imagine how much harder it is for them to adapt to a new situation, unless it's dire enough that it's a life or death situation. So culturally, politically, however you want to take a look at it or adjust it, these different races will be much slower to adapt to certain situations, unless, of course, the threat is dire enough that they are forced to. And that's, again, definitely a different scenario and situation for them to have to deal with. But again, culturally, historically, they're going to have different views just because of how long lived these, or shortly lived, these separate species are. So, I'm probably hitting a point where I'm going to talk in circles. I feel like I have made my point overall, and yeah, we're going to go ahead and call it there. I apologize for the weak exit from here. I hope you enjoyed today's video, though, and if you did, go on down there, hit the like button, let me know your thoughts down below. Or if you didn't like it, if you feel like I was just blowing smoke and talking out my ass the last 18 minutes or so, well, go on down there into the comments and say so. Let's engage in the discussion. Tell me where you think I could improve on these things. Hit the dislike button, too. It's all very helpful information for me, and it's the best way for me to get better is by, well, getting feedback from you fine folks out there on the interwebs. And if you did enjoy today's video, though, I've got good news for you, you lucky so-and-sos. There are 2 more videos popping up over this way. One is something the almighty, all-powerful, and all-seeing Google has decided you will enjoy. The other is another video I've done fairly recently myself, and I think you're going to get a kick out of it as well. Or, if this hasn't been your first stop here at the Gamer's Den, well then hell, there must be something you're enjoying about this channel. So go on down there, hit the subscribe button, and become a regular member? Become a regular member here at the Gamer's Den. Certainly, we'd be happy to have you. But, with all that said, once again, I've been your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire. Thank you all so very much for your time, and you all have yourselves a good night.